here during a day that is quite busy and with good weather. Actually, it's not that good because it's just starting to rain. Barbara, you have been very kind in your introduction, and I really would like to thank you for the invitation, and through you, the fantastic team of the foundation that has put this event together. I'm very happy to see many Africans also attending. And in anticipation, I would like to thank Petra for the moderation that she's going to offer. You know, I was listening to you, Barbara, and in the translation equipment, I saw that it is marked engineered and quality by Bosch, but made in China. And, you know, it's a bit the paradox that I was talking in another event, that we have to deal with a distribution of the chain, not the way we more or less got used to, which is the chain of production of objects, but now we are also dealing with the chain of knowledge. And we are commoditizing knowledge. Today, we have about 60% of the African population that doesn't have an ID card. And yet, Mr. Mark Zuckerberg and his Facebook probably know more about the movements of the people that don't have ID cards, some, than the registry of these countries do. We are going into a direction where the disruptions technologically and otherwise are so vast that we have to prepare for a completely different take in the way we analyze any geographical reality, and Africa is no exception. But when it comes to Africa, the deficit of knowledge is so huge that we have to make an extra effort not to help, not to assist, but just to understand. Because we think we know what we really don't know. So I want to start with some figures that are just going to contextualize how far most of the perceptions are, and I'm sure you are the exception, but how far most of the perceptions are in relation to reality. Let's say that we are talking about aid to Africa, which is a very topical subject. Well, it is around $52 billion a year. About 16, 17 years ago, the turn of the century, it was the same amount, so it has not increased. There are little variations, but it's more or less the same amount. In the same period, the collection of taxes in Africa has gone from about 63 billion to 600 billion. So which means that if we increase by 1% the efficiency of the tax collection, we get more money than development aid. 1% more. So it shouldn't be that difficult for Africans to actually find that money. But guess what is the reality? The reality is that you have a number of countries that depend sometimes up to 80% of one commodity, export earnings, and that's what the government deals with. That's the money they have for public spending. They don't really relate their fiscal machinery to the reality of their economy. It's like two different realities. You know, take a country like Nigeria. We have lots of Nigerians in the room. The oil sector today represents 10% of GDP, just 10%. But Nigeria is completely crippled because of the price of oil. How come? It's only 10% of GDP, because the earnings of the state are completely based on oil, which means that the economy is not really related to the fiscal reality. Unfortunately, despite this incredible progress I just mentioned on tax collection, what I didn't say, and I did it on purpose, is that the economies of the continent have also grown exponentially. So it is normal that we are now at the 600 billion, but we are not doing okay at all. because the fiscal pressure, which is the way we measure how much the fiscus get from the size of the economy, in Africa is about 17%. That's the continental average. And in the world, that average is 35%. So you see the gap. And that gap is despite the fact that we have been growing. In fact, I will tell you one story about Africa's growth. Africa is growing at the rates, if you compound, the periods for longer than 1 or 2 years, at the rates that countries like China did grow. How do I know this? Because if you look into any period of history of a particular country, it took them to double their GDP size. In Germany, you go into your statistical series, there is one period that you double your GDP. It took 60 years. In Africa, we have doubled our GDP in 15 years, which is the size of doubling GDP of China about 20 years ago. So when you compare this, you see that the reality is not one of going to beg about infrastructure investment. In fact, what is going on in terms of this 93 billion deficit of investment that is being mentioned many times? That figure, to start with, was put together 6 years ago. So it's completely outdated. In fact, since then, in the period of 6 years, Africa has actually surpassed the $100 billion annual investment in infrastructure. So in principle, we have dealt with that deficit. The issue is that the demands of the economy, because it has grown so much, are actually asking for much more infrastructure. And so if we revise the figure, we'll not be talking about 93 billion deficit. Probably we'll be talking about something that is a bit more realistic. One of the big investors in Africa infrastructure, China, would basically tell you that, that's 100 billion. That's what they invest in one city in China. So we are talking about continent. So it should be much more. Where are we going to find the money? Well, I gave you one insight. Maybe we should have a better fiscal apparatus that will take the money from our own savings and our own economic activity. But is that enough? And my answer is that that is not enough, because if you look into the history of any given country, how they build the basic infrastructure that propelled them into the industrial age, with a few exceptions, they did it with a lot of borrowing, and that borrowing explains why, for instance, the countries that are very successful in the world are also the ones that have the largest debt. We are not the ones who have the largest debt. You have the largest debt, sorry. Japan has 200% GDP debt. OECD average is 122%. We are struggling with 42%, and we are being considered a complete failure. 42%. In fact, when we started the structural adjustment programs, we had a debt of about 22% to GDP. We finished the structural adjustment programs with 122%. That was the contribution of structural adjustment. And then we fought back our way, partly with debt forgiveness. But, if you are an economist, you know that that debt was basically completely dead, overrated. It was not market value. But never mind. So with that forgiveness and everything, we end up in 2015 with a GDP to debt ratio of about 22%. And we are climbing very fast. But we are climbing very fast partly because there are structural problems in the world economy that cannot be resolved by Africa. And if there was a compact with Africa, those are the problems I would like to be resolved. I'll tell you number one problem, negative interest rates. What is negative interest rates? So you put your money in the bank in order to get less. That's what it is, right? How did we achieve that incredible development? We achieved it because we don't want to discuss the structural issues of the economy, because we prefer to discuss the marginal issues and elevate them to become the mainstream key issues. So I'm going to exemplify what I mean. If you have a population that is aging, and this population basically don't know how their future is going to look like, they are afraid of the future possibilities of risk. So the notion of risk changes. And that notion of risk changing means that you have to tighten whatever systems you have in place financially to make sure that the money is not going to vanish. So you translate this now in economic lingo. It's called banking regulations through Basel II and Basel III, which is a rules-based, way of making sure that the financial sector is tightened. The bank's ratio of capital has to increase, and in order for it to increase and be less risky, one of the things you tell them, you have to reduce your exposure. And part of reducing that exposure is to say, get out of Africa. So the banks that are quite present in Africa are being told by the regulators, you please get out of Africa, because you are with a level of exposure that will decrease your rating and will get you into trouble with the regulators. Therefore, get out of it. And the banks are getting out of it. So what is the point of discussing a compact with Africa when the banks are being told, get out of Africa? So that's one. Then, because you are afraid of the future, you don't want to discuss the aging issue because it's not politically palatable, you get into this very phenomenal behavior of negative interest rates, which basically means that at the time where we are going to borrow, in principle, if the interest rates are negative, it should be like a super bonus for us, Africa, because we don't even need to pay the same money, we pay less. The only problem is that no money is lended to us because of the issues I just mentioned. So we have no access to capital. So how are we going to resolve this problem? By making sure that in this compact or some measure that is put together by the G20 or Germany or G7, we are going to address these risk perception issues and address the financial regulation issues that are going to allow capital to flow in the direction of Africa. I haven't seen anything convincing in this field. So what I see is treating this as if it was a problem of you have to believe in Africa. Well, thank you very much. You are very kind. But the problem is that, the business people don't buy that. They want to believe in profiting. And I have no problems, no quarrels, that Africa contributes to some system that also allows for those who invest, those who are present, to profit. But it has to be done within a certain number of parameters. And that's what we need to discuss. And if we were going to have a serious discussion, then we'll see that how come in a potential austerity environment with a depressed economy globally, we are not investing in the world region that has the highest return on investment. Africa has 9.2 return on investment, and the world average not the world average, the developing countries' average is 7.5. So why is the money not coming? Well, and then we come into this very interesting dimension, which is called China. Because China actually got it. They got it, and they are making, basically, it's not just with Africa, they are making possible for some of the world truths, mainstream truths, to continue to prevail, despite skepticism on those who constructed those ideas and those proposals. So, climate change did not come from China. They were actually dead against it. Now they are the champions of it. Okay? Fighting against protectionism, liberalization, China didn't like that at all. Now they are the champions of liberal trade. And you can go on with a number of examples, but the one that interests our discussion is that China did not really imitate, occupy the space of former colonial and other potential actors in the African continent. They are just being offered it in a plate. And I'm going to be very precise because there are lots of confusions about numbers regarding China and Africa. Normally, we pull together numbers about this relationship in a haphazard way. We confuse trade with greenfield investments, with stock of foreign direct investment, with flows of capital and loans, and you also confuse very often all of this with aid. Typically, for every $4 of infrastructure involvement of China in the continent, only $1 comes from China. The other three are actually built by Chinese companies because they basically win the bids. Money comes from different sources, but they win the bids. And the reason why we have this perception of overwhelming presence is because they are winning a lot of bids. And they are winning a lot of bids because they have excessive capacity on construction and public works. They need to maintain their employment in these areas. And the best way for them to maintain it is to make sure that they put part of this excessive capacity in Africa. It can be for money that they have sponsored themselves, not concessional money, but just, normal commercial lending, or it can be because they win bids. What is wrong with that? There is a screaming about, China occupying Africa. I say, when I hear that, I say, oh, is that because they are our number one trading partner? But they are also the number one trading partner of the US and Brazil and Indonesia and I don't know how many countries in Europe. So what is the problem when it's Africa? All of a sudden, it's strange. Why? Because some have a claim, territorial claim, that Africa should not be the territory of liberal free trade. So I welcome. In fact, I condemn China for not putting enough, because I think that they should put much more on investment and much less on trade in order for the relationship to be more balanced. And when they announce sometimes, like in the last forum for China-Africa, 60 billion additional money of investment, nobody keeps really the data and the monitoring of these amounts to make sure that it's actually a different type of support than the one that they claim it is. So for me, the debate is skewed towards perceptions that are, to start with, wrong. And because the perceptions are wrong, we don't see Africa from the eyes of opportunities and also from the framing of the discussion from an African perspective. So I normally like to propose that we look into basically three types of changes that may contribute to this perception correction. The first change is actually a change about how we should handle the issue of risks, the risk perception. That is a job mostly for Africans to start, but where other partners of Africa have a long way also to go. And maybe the G20 can take this on and can propose changes that are significant. For instance, we have all these problems that are relating to the value chains and how they have basically not created opportunities for Africa to transform most of its commodities. I like to say that I'm not looking for Africa to produce the Toblerone and Godiva. I'm looking for cocoa paste, because if you were producing cocoa paste, which is just one segment of the chain, you can conserve the product, and you would not be in a situation like this year, where two African countries that produce 60% of the world cocoa, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, are experiencing a big crisis because they are at the worst in terms of prices in the last 10 years. And the companies that are dealing with chocolate are at their best in terms of profit. Why? Because they can play with the prices, because we don't transform even the cocoa into the cocoa paste. And this is true almost for everything. All the commodities, if you just add about 10% value addition, you will be able to actually offer 7 million additional jobs to the continent every year. We are not talking about transforming us into builders of rockets. We just want, like the translation equipment there, it can continue to be engineered and quality German, but made in Africa. I would be happy with 10% value addition. And I think this is the element that will change the risk perception, is when we are actually very specific about the value chains and it's not a generic debate. Because these generalities we are very much used to. Let's take 4 or 5 very important commodities for the continent, those who represent 60% of our earnings, and add for each one of them what it takes for the value chain to be partly owned by Africa. It's very simple, very specific. If I see it in a communique of the G20, I will applaud. But this lingo, like you are used to, doesn't go anywhere. The second is this change of alliances. As I mentioned, we have grown in terms of the trade relationships quite well, but the most important relationship for Africa is still not there, and that is the regional integration within Africa, because that's the one that is going to create most opportunities for the economic transformation of the continent and for its industrialization. When I say industrialization, I don't mean very simplistically that we are going to build the kind of factories that are being delocalized from more developed regions at a time where the robots will compete with us and automation. I'm talking about the systems of production, the organization of the economy that is commensurate with industrial age. And in most countries in Africa, we are not yet there. And that is what will create opportunities for increased productivity, including in the primary sector, including in different areas. And I think it's going to be absolutely fundamental for us, if we are going to do that, to have regional integration. Because that is going to create the markets that are going to position Africa differently. In fact, just to give you an illustration of how far this can go, you know that the G20 has a representative of the European Union. It's not a country, it's an organization. Nobody questions it. It's absolutely natural, isn't it? Well, what about if I tell you that the African Union members together have a GDP that will place them in the top 7? Would you accept that they should also have a natural seat in the G20? Even more, a natural seat in the G7? Nobody accepts this. Why? Because the regional integration is not visible and effective for us to claim such an opportunity. Even with the numbers that we have today, it would have been possible. But the continental free trade area that is being discussed would create even more opportunities. So this is a fundamental prerequisite for us to actually change and transform our economic reality. And finally, the last one that I really want to share with you is the issue of how we deal with the correction of our political governance. And this is a very important point because it gets really simplified. It gets simplified because we always see Africa from the prism of security and migration. Security and migration. Security and migration. What is not said in the communique of the G7, where luckily Africans got one paragraph, paragraph 26, and it's probably going to be repeated more or less, maybe with more paragraphs in the G20 communique, is completely centered in the preoccupation about security and migration, although it doesn't say by its name. This is not a way of looking at us. It's not a way of looking at us, first because it's completely erroneous from just an analytical point of view. Africans that migrate outside Africa, I keep repeating, are about 2 million per year outside Africa. Chinese that migrate outside of China, and I'm comparing Africa with China because China has more people than Africa, okay? And it's growing. 10, now 7%. It's about 10 million a year. Nobody questions how come there are 10 million Chinese that despite their growth are getting out of China. Maybe because of human rights, they say. And we question the 2 million that are getting out of Africa, and we say it's because of conflict and poverty. Conflict and poverty. Is it? Is it? Some of the people that are actually going out of the continent are definitely moving because of poverty and conflict. But is it all of them? I'm not so sure about it. Neither am I sure that if Africa continues to grow and even grow more, this will stop. I think it actually will accelerate. Remember that during the Marshall Plan, since it's a la mode to mention Marshall Plan, Europe was benefiting from huge inflows of capital, and great growth rates in some of the countries in Europe were above 6%, like in Italy, and they were migrating massively outside Italy, despite 6% growth. So make no mistake, the fact that Africa is going to grow or not grow has nothing to do with human mobility. You have to understand human mobility from a much more complex framework. And the same happens with security. Who is ready to believe that the number of casualties in Southeast Asia is a very prominent growth area. The number of casualties in Southeast Asia is larger, according to the Uppsala records on conflict casualties, which are the best in the world, is larger than West Africa if you exclude Boko Haram. Larger. Who is ready to believe that the number of homicides in Rio de Janeiro is larger than the number of casualties in the Great Lakes region. Do they have a UN mission there, peacekeeping in Rio de Janeiro, or peacekeeping in Southeast Asia? They don't. And part is because, again, we are in this trap of perceptions and the way Africa is infantilized. It's never taken seriously. And because we don't have one member in the Security Council, like China, that can stop North Korea being discussed by the Security Council, or the Rohingya being discussed in the Security Council. They are not discussed because China will not allow. Where is the African equivalent? It's not there. So the issue of voice is very important. We cannot trade and say, because of efficiency, let's meet at the G7 and sort out the world economy, or let's meet at the G20 and we make it more inclusive. In both of them, Africa is largely absent. And they are discussing things that concern us. We don't want to be there as guests, because guests means you have to receive an invitation. And that invitation actually changes depending on which leader you got. You know, if this is a leader that, you know, it's not likable, the invitation goes to your neighbor. That's what happens. So we have to be able to say things as they are. And when we discuss governance, human rights, these issues have also to be part of the discussion. I'm not saying they are not important, but they are part of the discussion. So we are not infantilized, and people don't deal with these kind of problems that are quite serious in Africa differently from what they would deal in Southeast Asia. They would deal with the Mindanao conflict. You know, I haven't heard that Mr. Duterte has been mentioned in the International Court of Justice. International Criminal Court, sorry. And everybody knows what is going on in the Philippines. So that's the difference. And it's a difference that the Africans got tired. So when they are invited to be part of all these compacts, they love it. Why? We love the attention. I would have missed if I didn't come to Berlin and in the year of Africa. I mean, it's definitely been a disaster. I'm here. But I have to make really that an opportunity to say things. And that's what I'm trying to do. So, we all do respect. Barbara, I'm going to correct one figure that you gave, just as an example. You quoted, so it's not your figure, so rest in peace. You quoted the UN, and I used to work with the UN until a few months ago, saying that we are going to witness this year the worst famine since Second World War. That's what the UN said. And it touched people like you. Is it true? It's a complete lie. It's a complete fallacy. And why is it? Well, there are very good intentions why this is proclaimed. The intentions is that, yes, we have a drought, people are suffering, there is a fatigue of contributing to humanitarian response, so you need to do something dramatic for people to react. And with the best of intentions, someone concocted this line. Nobody got into the detail of actually verifying whether it was true by number of victims, by whatever criteria. You just go. There was, just in China, since it's a growth country, there were 2 famines worse than the one that is projected for this year in Africa, according to the numbers that have been mentioned, which numbers nobody actually verified. But even with those numbers, 7 famines were worse than this one, and 2 were in China. So why is it that we continue to have this kind of perceptions? Because we repeat, and the Africans have to stand out and claim their space for a different narrative.
How many people are really?
2 million people. So, 2 million people. So I think it's very important for us to say that if 2 million people are going to die in Africa, as it is proclaimed, and just one of the famines in China was 30 million, the issue is not about discussing whether humanitarian response is justified or not. Obviously it is. Obviously it is. And we have to do something about it. But we contribute indirectly for a narrative that is going to perturb the risk perception, the changes, all the things that I've just mentioned. So I hope that you, after discussions of this day and a half, will start basically questioning a lot of the numbers that are thrown at you about Africa. And to just finish with one that is my favorite. Those who have listened to me 2 or 3 times are going to say I'm repetitive. There are only 12 African countries out of 54 that have their national accounts up to date, if you take into account the statistical methodological requirements that the year base should not be older than 5. So I'm saying it very slowly for the non-economists, which means that we have a huge underestimation of Africa's GDP. But even with the figures as you know them, we should be in the G7. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I know there are very few people that are able to make statistics sing. Normally, when I hear something about statistics, I know it's going to be boring and dull. And I was pretty tired when this conference started, and you woke me up, so thanks for that. And you really stirred up the pot. I mean, I have to admit that some of the perceptions about Africa that you mentioned, that I have them as well. So we should probably invite you much more often if you need any further reason to come to Berlin.
It doesn't need to be the year of Africa.
Even without having a year of Africa. And you're absolutely right. I saw you at the conference, and we spoke briefly after the conference about being invited means that you might not be invited. So you want to be part of the group. And I mentioned this German say, which is that guests are like fish. They start to stink after a couple of days when they don't go. So it's a difference being part of a group and being invited. Nevertheless, the first question I have is that you talk about Africa. Is there such a thing like Africa? Is it okay to just talk about Africa? Because I'm asking this because some of the discussion that we are having here is that also Africa is a construction, that it's far too easy for us to talk about Africa, the dark continent, the disaster, whatsoever.
Well, it's a good point. It's a social construct, it's a political construct, and it is as valid as a national construct. Mm-hmm. Very often the national construct is also somehow fabricated, and it's not really based on more than some very specific historical points of connection. But yet, governments engage their population taking into account that particular reality. Let's say we are talking about Spain. Right now, the Catalans are fighting to have their own independence or identity, and I don't know whether it's the majority of the Catalans or not. That's not my point. But it's not just the Catalans. There are a number of identities within Spain that, consider themselves partly Spanish, but also claiming their own specificities and their own independence within the federal construct. And it's fine with it. It's fine in Switzerland, it's fine in Belgium, it's fine in a number of countries. Why would it be any different in a situation where we are talking about a continent if there are points of attachment historically, people can identify with, and politically there is a desire. That's what makes us speak in the way we do.
Mm-hmm.
I do have three observations that are more specifically African than what I just said that for me relates to any reality of this type. The first is that, Pan-Africanism is a very strong ideology in the continent. It has inspired the struggle for independence across the continent. It is a construct, if you go ideologically at its origins, it's a construct of the diaspora. So these were mostly diaspora in the Americas that started the movement of Pan-Africanism. And it has been completely adopted. There is no declaration in the last 50-something years that is not referring to Pan-Africanism. So if that is true, and there is enough capital, politically and symbolically, why not speak about Africa? The second observation is that we notice that most international organizations like to divide Africa between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And this partitioning is contrary to the ideology I just mentioned, and it is also done with a purpose. So you can see that sometimes you can influence the reality in two ways. From the inside, the Africans want to talk about Pan-Africanism. From the World Bank perspective, just to give an example, they prefer to talk about Sub-Saharan Africa. I would have no quarrels if the department in charge of Sub-Saharan Africa was called Sub-Saharan Africa Department, or the IMF department was called Sub-Saharan Africa Department. It is not. It's called Africa. Why is it that, something that you call geographically one thing, actually in statistical and analytical terms is something different? And when confronted, they really don't have a very good answer, but I have an answer for them. That's a colonial divide. It's a colonial divide. And
so
then the third
we divide you when it
convenient,
fits, and we talk about Africa
when it's convenient.
Okay.
So we are divided when it's convenient. We are pulled together when it's convenient. And the third observation is to say that when it comes to Africa as a construct, there is normally some skepticism on the part of Africans themselves if we compare Africa with India and China, which people like me do all the time. And the reason it is convenient to do so is because it's a very unique comparator, because from a demographic point of view, these two countries are the only ones that have more population than the continent. And we are in the same predicament they were or are, and therefore the comparator becomes extremely appealing. So with excuses for lumping together one continent with one country alone, you can derive a number of very interesting conclusions. Like, for instance, if you tell people that the star performer of the world economy, which is India, actually has less per capita income than Africa, and that has less participation in world trade than Africa, that has less cell phones than Africa, that has less foreign direct investment than Africa, that has less disposable income than Africa, people say, really? And that's why the comparator becomes interesting. And then to achieve it all, you say, and who is the number one investor in India? Is it China? Is it the US? Is it Germany?
I have no clue.
Is it Japan? Well, those are big economies. Well, the number one investor in India is an African country, Mauritius.
No, you're kidding. I like your play with the numbers. It's really good. You could go on and go on. You asked me to ask the killer questions. You asked you to ask you a question that make you feel uncomfortable. Let me try this one. During your speech, you made the argument that the Africans themselves don't make their voices heard enough. So if the EU has a natural seat at the G20, the African Union has not, and it's due to the fact that it's politically not strong enough that it can make its voice heard. So is it just us not wanting you at the table, or are you not pushing enough at the door?
You know, you claim your space. It's a struggle, so I don't think it's for anybody else to struggle on our behalf. So it has to go both ways. We cannot say, we don't like to be patronized, but can you please fight for us and create a space for us? So it goes together. Africans have to fight for their own space, and they don't. And therefore, it's our fault first. But that doesn't mean we are not going to denounce it.
Okay, we wait. Let me ask the second killer question. When we talk about development, quite often you hear from people, the Chinese got it right, the Asians got it right, they got their part of the value chain, the Africans just didn't. So it's not our fault, it's not the fault of the West, of the G20, it's the African fault. What do you answer them, besides all the numbers that you...
The Chinese got it right thanks to their genius and a lot of characteristics that are unique to them, but also because there was a need to delocalize most of the manufacturing into where, you know, the conditions were more attractive, including labor costs. The Chinese are now going to face the same music that Europeans and the United States and others faced before. Their labor costs have risen significantly. They tried to automate as much as they could, but still it's not enough. There are costs that will be prohibitive, and therefore they want to delocalize as well. They can delocalize in many parts of the world, as they are doing, but they can also delocalize one part in the direction of Africa. Mm-hmm. And that's also what they are doing. So I don't think Africa is going to be either privileged by this delocalization from China, neither is going to be neglected. It's going to have a slice. How big is that slice going to be? It depends on how Africans get organized and how they structure themselves. Some countries are ahead of others. They will get more. I once discussed with a Chinese senior official, and I said to him, people criticize China. I just wanted to have the reaction. People criticize China because you basically come with turnkey projects, and you know it's your labor that come and you occupy basically a labor space, and there's nothing that is really left to the country. So this is the sort of perception that we cultivated about the Chinese, and there was some truth, you know, about 15 years ago. Today, about 85% of the infrastructure projects that China handles in the continent as, or rather 85% of the labor of those projects is African, and about 40% of the management is African, which means that they are creating jobs. And what people don't realize is that about 1/3 of their proper foreign direct investment is on manufacturing. So things have changed, but what he said at the time, this senior official, is very revealing. He said to me, we learn. We are going to learn. And you know, I discounted that. You know, here we are, 15 years later, they have learned. And what is really bothering me is that they have learned partly because some countries made it clear that this was not tolerable, this was not possible. They put in place regulation and policies to make it impossible for them to operate under those terms. But others did not. And you can see the difference. Just go around the countries and you see how the Chinese behave in Ethiopia and how they behave in Congo, Brazzaville. It's a completely different behavior.
Would you also, I mean, we have been very critical of the German compact, our plans for Africa. Would you then argue that we are not able to learn? I just checked all the plans for Africa that we had during the last 20 years. You can't count them. It's so many where we wanted to help you, always with this attitude, we helping you, and now comes the next one. So are we unable to learn? Are our governments unable to learn, or would you actually argue they're just not really interested this is more internal kind of communication that we do something about the world.
Well, you know your political system better than I do. I would just say this. The Marshall Plan numbers that are announced, I understand that now the name is changing.
Yeah, they don't call it Marshall Plan officially
Yes.
any longer. There was too much criticism.
I said several times, it's the equivalent to the budget of a mid-sized city in Germany. So if you want to compare Africa with a mid-sized city, that's okay. We get the point.
There's also this other plan, the Compact, the G20 thing. What's your comment about that one? Basically the same?
Well, it's a bit more sophisticated in its approach, but I think the emphasis is right in some aspects. So let's not throw the baby with the bathwater. Mm-hmm. There are elements about creating the conducive environment in terms of regulations, in terms of creating space for institutional funds, and all those things that are very attractive. The problem is that the context is much more complex than these documents want to acknowledge, and that's what I was trying to drive at. That, if you have a situation where the financial regulations prevailing in the world are creating disincentives, if you have a situation where negative interest rates are establishing new standards for risk, if you have a number of other factors that I delineated, it's obvious that what we have in the Compact is not going to work.
Just a final question before I'm going to open it up for this great audience. I know you worked with Kofi Annan. If you were Kofi Annan and if you had the money the IMF could spend, if you had also a certain power, what kind of plan would you draw? Or would you draw none and just say, forget about the plans?
Well, the Africans have their own aspirational plan, which is Agenda 2063. And because I was also involved in that process, I would say that's the plan that the Africans constructed, therefore that's the one they want. It will be very easy to cross-reference that document and pretend that is completely compatible. Because we are used to these exercises of cross-referencing. It's very common.
What do you mean by cross-references?
You create a different document, but you say in every other paragraph, Agenda 2063, etc. So you give the impression that actually you are absolutely compatible. You have cross-referenced the document, but you have actually not really done what is necessary. For me, there is an incredible important role that development aid should play nowadays in Africa. And that role is to create and multiply the domestic resource capabilities of the countries. If you really invest in improving our tax collection systems,
we could improve ours as well.
If you invest in making sure that our customs are going to be compatible with the European Union standards on commodity pricing that allow for an European customs official to know whether there is an underreporting of the merchandises that are getting into the country, etc., etc. You are multiplying our resources and enabling us to make our own decisions with our own money. As I said, just 1% efficiency gain is more than aid. That's where the money should go. It's not patronizing, it's efficiency related, and it's based on best practices anywhere in the world. If you think that a country like DRC, every time it has elections, the international community, which is an euphemism, puts about $500 million for the voters' roll in the elections to be run. And when they leave, the country still doesn't have people with a civil registration and ID. And then 5 years later, another $500 million. And again, the same story. What is the logic of this? You know, you were talking about informal sector, making sure that you modernize the country, not just the economy. It starts with that. It starts with, you know, having some tracking of people from when they are born until they are dead. You cannot run a country where you don't know where your population is and, you know, where they are. They don't have any.
You need, how many hospitals you need?
Yes, everything. You can't plan, you can't strategize, you can't modernize. And you know, I found it really strange that after 30 years of development aid, this issue is not yet addressed. We should start by what is essential.
Thank you. That sounds so logic that you wonder why nobody's going there. Let me open the debate for you. I think there should be microphones somewhere. Maybe we have a couple of guests from Africa. Is there anybody who would like to add something to what we heard? So, is there a microphone? Yeah, there's a microphone in the back. If you could just present yourself briefly so that we know where you come from. What's your perspective?
Thank you. My name is Tony Carbo, and I'm from the Center for Conflict Resolution in Cape Town, South Africa. I am very much impressed by the presentation Carlos has given. The figures, even though they are, you know, depressing in certain areas, tend to have some type of veracity to them. I'm wondering, however, that throughout the presentation, it seems that Carlos is pointing the finger elsewhere as the problems belong somewhere other than within the continent itself. If most of the African countries have been independent for at least most of them for more than 50 years, I seem to wonder, is there some responsibility we must be given to us Africans? Do we have any responsibility at all for the conditions in which we find ourselves? I remember a few years ago, I think it was in 2011, when the wave of revolutions, you know, started in North Africa. And at the time, there was a call for the ousting of, the Libyan leader. And I remember in the UN, there was a hot debate, but the Africans themselves, you know, really, who were sitting in the Security Council, were the first people to, support a motion to oust, Gaddafi. I wonder whether or not our leaders have some responsibility in terms of governance. You just gave the example of DR Congo. Since 1961 or 1963, when they got their independence, I mean, can't they really structure some system where they can themselves, with all the resources they have, get a register for voters, for God's sake? I mean, they make an awful lot of money in terms of, the extractive industries. I mean, you can name all kinds of issues, but my question basically, Carlos, is there any responsibility that we must take for ourselves on the continent?
Carlos, you want to respond directly? Maybe we could collect some... Sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am Martin Sunke, coming from Cameroon. And I just want to add my comment to what Carlos just presented. I don't want to get the pretension of giving an answer to what my brother just asked there. I will leave it to Carlos. But I think Carlos was clear enough to say we also have our responsibility in this. And we do have a responsibility in that. My comment is not about that. My comment is about the cross-referencing of Agenda 2063. This is crucial, and I think Carlos did not go deep into that. And this is where we should be discussing. When you say you are doing any compact or Marshall Plan or whatever for Africa or with Africa, you can do it without Africans discussing it with you. And Africans have already discussed what they expect from anyone. And that's what is prescribed in the Agenda 2063. You don't just have to say you are going to do this in the agenda, that in the agenda, without really going to understand the agenda with Africans, because they are the ones who should explain the agenda to anyone who wants to come and join in implementing the agenda. And I think that's what we should be discussing here. We should be discussing Africans' expectation before we propose any plan for or with Africans. Thank you, Carlos, for the presentation.
Thank you very much. Maybe you can just hand the microphone to the lady in front of you, and then we go to the...
Yeah, thank you. Claudia Simons from the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. Thanks, Carlos, for this very enlightening speech. I have one question. When we talk about investment, be it in the initiatives here in Germany or globally, we talk a lot about boosting job creation. And you mentioned China and, labor costs rising, so maybe there's going to be a share on like outsourcing labor also to African countries. And I want to ask you, do you really want to have sweatshops in Kenya? So, because when we talk about boosting job creation, are we talking about dignified working conditions, or are we only talking about very low costs of labor? What about social security? What about human rights? And so on and so forth. How do you see the future of that in Africa?
Maybe we take one more, and then you could give it to Nancy, and then we go to the center in the next round.
Thank you for the wonderful speech. Last month, the president of the World Bank, Jim Kim, gave a speech at London School of Economics where he said his dream was that one day UK pensioners or pensioners who are like invested in roads, say in Dar es Salaam, are supported by the people paying those tolls. And, I thought about it, and so people in Dar es Salaam pay tolls for 30 years, and all that, or so much of that revenue goes to UK pensioners, because we all know, OECD pensions are 30 trillion and African pensions are 400 billion. And I just wondered what you think about this as a source of finance, because that's what the Continental Business Network for Africa really wants, is all this pension fund money, but will it drain Africa or will it help?
Ooh, just a couple of pretty dense questions.
Yes, very interesting questions. I'm going to respond fast because I see that others want to intervene. And I agree with a lot of the comments that were made. Maybe it's a matter of emphasis, but I'm absolutely with you that the responsibility, first and foremost, belongs to the Africans. And the Africans have to make their leaders accountable for the things that have not happened. And they don't do it enough. And we need to also, through discussions and through information, make sure that this accountability is improved, because people get more information, they know what to ask. So the ask part is missing because there is not enough information. But DRC is a bad example that you picked. You should have picked another one. Because DRC has a peacekeeping mission that has been there for 57 years. 57 years. What the heck are they doing there for 57 years? You should ask that question. And then, it will explain a lot of other things, including why there are no civil registration records and the rest. But I think it doesn't preclude the need for us to make our leaders accountable. We are absolutely on the same page there. Boosting job creation has a lot to do with understanding that part of the movement of people from, let's say, the rural parts of India, of China, towards the coast, has reached its peak. And therefore, the cheap labor that the manufacturing leaders in China could benefit from within China is coming to an end. And it's coming to an end because of also evolution of the society and the fact that now they have also social security costs and all kinds of associated costs. And I would argue that Africa has to have a level of ambition that is commensurate with where it starts in this process of integrating complex value chains. If we try to reach, this is one area where we cannot leapfrog. If we try to reach to the best security, social security system, these jobs are not going to come to Africa. I want them to come to Africa, and I know that it's going to be in a system where Africans will be shortchanged at the beginning. But it is still interesting enough because it's better than the informality and the precarity that we are witnessing right now. You have to be very realistic in terms of the level of ambition according to the progress you make. For instance, this will not be acceptable in a country where the social security system has already become quite sophisticated, let's say South Africa. But it is absolutely possible for countries where the minimum wage is less than $60. And therefore, you know, you have to be capable of absorbing by waves what comes with this type of attractiveness. You can't get it all in one go. Justin Lin, who is the former chief economist of the World Bank and the brains behind some of these developments in relation to Africa in the China policy, says that about 84 million jobs will migrate out of China. And he estimates that about 30 million jobs may come to Africa over time. I don't know whether this is going to happen or not. You know, his hypothesis is very attractive. But what I know is that these 30 million jobs are going to be at the very low end of the scale. So the Chinese will no longer produce plastics, toys, and you name it, because it will be cheaper to do it in Africa, and it will be cheaper than doing it with robots. And that's the reality. Once you get into the value chains, then you can increase your value addition, and you can have ambitions that right now are just prohibitive and are not just available to Africa. Cross-referencing, yes, cross-referencing is international relations habit these days. So we cross-reference everything, and we don't pay too much attention to what policy implications are. But the role of think tanks, like this meeting that is taking place here in Berlin, organized around the think tanks, the T20, is precisely to address those gaps. I think the issue of pension funds, well, I'm actually very happy that Africans have $400 billion of pension fund money, because $400 billion of pension fund money could have been used in incredible ways favorable to the economic transformation of the continent, and they are not. It's the same with the remittances from migrants that are now at 61 billion, and they are not used properly. It's the same with commercial banks that have more than $80 billion sitting idle. We can go on with the list. In fact, that list brought us to a figure that I publicized 4 years ago of about $1 trillion that were available for investment in Africa, from Africa, if the right things were done. But again, we go back to the issue of leadership. You know, if you typically, people are fighting in any given country in Africa to be a minister rather than the president of the pension fund. When the pension fund is where the money is, and it's completely run down and not properly managed and with a complete disaster. And yet, some of the best asset managers in the world are actually African. You know, you have South African asset managers that are dealing with management of assets from around the world because of their expertise, and we don't use it.
I think I'll take another round of questions. Would you, where's the microphone? Could you just give it to the sir in the second row?
Good evening. My name is Winston Asuchukwu from Nigeria. When I listened to the figures you gave about the perception problem that Africa has, it sets me back to something that I did. I used to run securities and asset management for EcoBank. And my first day at work, we had a strategy meeting. And I asked the question, why isn't every transaction that is done in sub-Saharan Africa done with eco dollars, since we're everywhere? And from that conversation, we went out and we did some research to figure out exactly what you said. And we created an index that is currently available on Bloomberg called the Middle Africa Bond Index. Everything you said showed up in glaring colors. Africa was less risky than the JP Morgan Emerging Market Bond Index. Gave a higher return, and here's the kicker, was almost negatively correlated, which means that dollar for dollar, an investment in local currency bonds in Africa would not only give you a higher return, but will add as an insurance policy on the rest of your portfolio if you had invested in Africa. So when we saw those numbers and we tried to push, that is the big perception I think that's missing. And I think it's up to us to get that message out as hard as possible.
Again, we are talking about perceptions. But could you just answer me the question, why is then Africa itself not building up this financial sector that then could use the money in Africa?
Well, I will say this much. Based on from my personal perspective is this. I look at my parents who came into adulthood in the 70s. And I look at how life changed for them from about 75, 76 to the mid-80s. The complete destruction of value and complete destruction of value that happened with hyperinflation across Africa systematically changed the way people looked at money and investment. Mm-hmm. And if you look at it, it has moved people from being able to look 3, 4, 5 years down the road to looking right in front of them. And in fact, I gave this same speech I had a meeting with Schlumberger. I gave them a presentation. And at the end of the presentation, I asked them a simple question. Do you have a 5-year strategic plan? And everybody laughs and goes, of course we do. We renew it every year. I'm like, for your company? They said yes. Then the simple question was, then why do you invest as if you're going to die tomorrow? Every single investment is done in Africa based on almost a 365-day cycle. We renew our total investment portfolio every 365 days. You cannot make any change economically in a society if you have to refinance everything every 365 days. It's not possible.
Okay, thanks. Could you hand over the microphone to the sir next to you, and then we...
I think this may have been said, but I would really reiterate the question again. Sorry, my name is Kari Bulkar. I'm the chairman of Nigerian Economic Summit Group. I think it's Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, said, character is your destiny. Your character is your destiny. Is there something that is flawed in the African character that 50, 60 years after independence, therefore we shouldn't be holding on to colonial history? We've been free, so to speak. And if you go through the African map, you see a lot of wave of democratic settings that have gone through years, if not decades, of the democratic setup. However, there is no correlation whatsoever between the standard of living and the governance structure so far attained. Is it something of a character flaw?
Wow. Now, let me ask you something. It's getting hot. We are running out of time. Should I take 2, 3 more questions? Or would you look like it's really interesting? I think so too. Those two, the sir just in the back, and then the sir, and then we go to you. And then we go back to... Yeah.
My name is Bekele. I come from Ethiopia. I think I can understand what the guy tries to say, whether the problem lies in the African leadership or not. We are discussing, about 2 different things. Africa is the most raped continent in the world. Slavery, colonialism, and from the 1960s on, all the economic policies, import substitution, industrialization, basic needs, structural adjustment programs, all these policies came from outside without being discussed in Africa. All the theoretical models, policies were developed in Europe. I'm not sure whether the African leadership, the political elite, the economic elite, do understand all these economic policies like mercantilism, like Keynesianism, like classical economics, like neoclassical economics, like neoliberalism, and so on and so on. Without exhaustively discussing all these kinds of things, within the African continent, if things are come from outside without having understood, if we practice them, the side effect is too much negative. And you tried, to, portray the image of Africa too much positively. I don't see it like that, Africa is, in all terms, if you see the state system in Africa, it was an imposed state system. It's not organically grown like in the European state systems, from the Renaissance, from the Enlightenment, and so on and so on, We all lack all these kinds of, state building systems, what we call it enlightenment, That is a problem what many African countries do face. And from this perspective, I think we have to discuss it, from an entirely different perspective if we bring a genuine development in African countries, in each African country, then we can go on to Pan-Africanism on whatever you want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Could you be brief? So you can
I'm always brief.
Thank
Heiner
you.
Banking, Council of Global Issues and Global Commons Alliance within UNECA. First, I enjoyed your jungling with numbers, but I wonder, or would you agree, that when to compare, we need, for density, scales, proportions, consequences, we need fidelity and equal area maps. So you see all these maps are not to scale. Asia is 3 times bigger than Africa. So this is my first thing. My second, have you studied the fate and learnings after Africa Beyond Poverty? We organized with Odera Uruka 95 in Nairobi. So there we had Gandhi Society, Bishop Tutu, the Dutch government, and all the Scandinavians on desk. So is there a study about the failures? I would like to look at it. And last, they always say with and for Africa. Have you heard about the motion of light in Africa and light also in our minds? It was done 4 days here in Germany to really show the intersectorial strategic dilemmas and how to link bottom up the SDGs. I couldn't make it shorter.
Thank you. Now we take 2 more. One in the first row and in the second, and then we come back to you. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that inspiring talk. Julia Leininger from the German Development Institute. I have actually 3 short questions. The first one is, what is your vision? Let's imagine that the risk perception is overcome, the problem of the risk perception, and investments are there, the taxes are there. Will the life of people be better? Second, when you refer to political governance and voice, you refer to the G21 and with an African seat, which I really do favor as well. My question would be, what does political governance needs to look like within the countries? And since you talked about accountability and at the same time said China is on the right way, because my feeling is that holding the government accountable in China is quite difficult. So my question would be, what is that political governance that is needed in Africa? And my third question, as a social scientist, I'd really like to know where you get your data from, because I do see the same data problems.
You open your sources afterward. So, final question.
My name is Jayola, Nigerian Economic Summit Group. And my question is, I just want to take you on the first topic, the issue of risk perception. Whether it's within the German plan or the G20 plan, it's about how do we leverage private capital to fund what is it we need in Africa. But if you have this risk perception that will make banks and private capital not to come, what must we be doing now? How can we as Africans begin to engage and confront those perceptions so that we change things?
And now the answer in 2 minutes.
Well, you know, I'm quite used to being pushed back as an optimist, but I absolutely refuse that, because I don't think it is about me being optimist. It's about the deficit of perception being so huge that when you say things that sound different, people think you are being an optimist. So my challenge is for you to go and check every data that I mention here, because it's not like Julia, they are secret. It's just because we don't use them the way I'm using it, with comparators in 2 ways: comparators historically and geographically. And when you do that, it's a very simple exercise. Immediately you discover things that normally are not perceptible. Like, for instance, if I say that Africa has doubled its GDP in 15 years and China did the same, go check, it's there. You have the historical dimension and you have also the geographical dimension. But people don't do those types of exercises. Well, I was fortunate enough to work for 5 years leading the Economic Commission for Africa. For those who don't know, is the UN development policy structure for the continent. It's based in Addis Ababa. It has 1,000 people. It has 300 economists. It has 60 statisticians. So I could really put these people to work. They hate me probably. And I made sure that during my leadership, I was going to extract the type of data that allows me to speak the way I do. So, and I think it's nothing secret. It's just about making these comparators alive and making sure that we understand, you know, that Africa cannot be seen in isolation. So I will start by challenging you with your map. You said that Africa is much smaller than Asia. That's an evidence. But what is not so clear for people is that everybody uses the Mercator projection, including Google, that was established in the 17th century because of navigation, you know, requirements, that basically shortchanges Africa so much that it puts us almost at the size of the Greenland. And, you know, it is so pervasive as a problem of perception that Africa is much bigger than people think. It's the US, China, India, all of Western Europe, and parts of other parts of the world like Japan, etc., included. That's not what people think. That if you were just 2 weeks ago in the African Development Bank annual assembly that was in Ahmedabad, you would see that the logo of the conference is two maps, the map of Africa and the map of India. Guess what? Same size. Yet, the real size is that India is the equivalent of the Horn of Africa. So, you see, who is shortchanged? Not me, because I compared with China. I didn't compare with Asia. I can compare with Asia, actually, by saying this much. Africa is the continent that grows the most in the world right now, because that's true in continental terms. Because if you include all of Asia, you have a lot of losers and a lot of non-performers. But that's not what is done by international organizations. They isolate the good Asia from the bad Asia. And the same for conflict. Much more people are affected by conflict in Asia, much more casualties. You just need to look into Syria or before Afghanistan and so on, but that's not what we do. So yes, I know how to compare Africa with Asia favorably, but that's not what I did. What I did was to compare with China, and I explained it was for demographic reasons. And that I stick to my position, because I think it's very relevant, and it's a motivation for Africans to know that historically, about 30 years ago, the GDP per capita of China was lower than what Africa has right now. So if they did it, why not? We can do it as well. Now, I think that the issue of whether we should juxtapose the national realities in the way I did, which is the question that came from my brother from Ethiopia. Well, my very clear historical social scientist background tells me that what you said about Europe is not true. Maybe it's true for Africa, but since you cross-referenced Europe, it's not valid as a point, because most of the states in Europe were not created out of enlightenment. They were created out of wars. They were created out of conflicts. And the Westphalian process is there to show how the separation between church and state was done. And then the states were not constituted on the basis of ethnic unification. That came afterwards. So what is true for Europe actually is true for Africa. So you have to choose whether you want us to look bad by comparing with that Europe, or you want us to look good by saying we are actually quite different. We are doing better than Europe did then. Another point that I think is very important is to these policy models. I absolutely believe that the reason we have not made more progress is because the policy models were adopted by the leadership of Africa uncritically. So it is the problem of the leadership of the continent that has been very fast in adopting, say, consumption patterns. They love champagne. They love the Mercedes. They have no problems that champagne comes from France and the Mercedes come from Germany. But they will not adopt, some characteristics that are linked to institution building in France or efficiency engineering in Germany. So we adopt uncritically the policies, and therefore, we pick the ones that are easy and we don't deal with the ones that are difficult. So we should not really take this for granted, that, it's all about imposition and so on. I'm not so sure that the colonial model is over, because if you look into the infrastructure, it's all about ports and roads around the coast to bring something from where the mines are. So we are not yet completely out of it. But definitely, I will never say that this is now done because the colonial influence is there. It's done because we are uncritical and we are not capable of taking the right decisions. So who forbids us from taking them? And you have examples of countries that are doing the right thing, and guess what? They actually get more aid, not less. They insult, they criticize, they say this is not what we want, and so on. They get even more aid than the ones that are just clapping. So, I mean, there is very clear lessons there that we should do things differently. And that's my vision. Basically, my vision is that we have to have the real ownership. You know, when we talk about ownership, it's a very easy catch-all concept. There is ownership of the idea, there is ownership of a process, there is ownership of the financial means, there is ownership of the evaluation and accountability, there is ownership of the policy. There are many forms of ownership. And normally, what we do is to discuss ownership in such vague terms that everybody can get away with just keeping things the way they are. Whose fault? In this case, the protagonism has to come from the Africans. It's about African agency. And if the African agency is going to be exercised, what I'm claiming is that it has to start with better knowledge and context. And if you don't have the better knowledge and context that I'm trying to proclaim is absolutely fundamental, is absolutely essential, it's a premise for everything that we do thereafter, we are bound to have failure, because it basically means we have not done our homework. And what I'm trying to instill as an attitude, it's basically an attitude. You said character, is that type of attitude. And I hope that it's not going to be something that we ask others to do for Africa. It's something that Africans have to do, not only for themselves, but for the world. Because Africa is part of the solution. I mentioned at the very beginning of my intervention the issue of demographics, but I didn't actually elaborate on it. This year, in the celebration of the centennial that the Japanese do every year, the number of nominees were 32,000. These are people with 100 years completed during the last 4 years. They join another 30,000. That means you have in Japan 62,000 people that are 100 years or older. By 2050, they are going to jump to 500,000. And by the end of the century, they are going to be close to 2 million. These are the projections. Now, they have 200% GDP to debt ratio. Who is going to pay for this? Who is going to pay for this incredible development, demographically speaking? Some people say robots. Robots paying social security? Robots paying pension funds? Good luck.
I actually think there's nothing else to say. I thank you. I'm pretty well known for being a tight moderator with the timetable. I overstepped my borders, so to say, this evening, because I really enjoyed listening to you, and I think the audience did as well. So the only thing I can still do is to invite you downstairs to a drink and a snack, and to thank you very much for your enlightening speech. Thanks.